Alright guys, we'll be getting the UR version of Hirugami, the rerun banner very soon. So let's do a quick comparison between the UR version and also the SP version to see whether or not the UR one is still valuable. And I will also give you some of my thoughts on whether or not I think you should still try to summon for it. Now, a lot of the skills a lot of the things that they're able to offer are actually quite similar. And as per usual, you guys can read the skill description yourself, so I'm not going to repeat that. Instead, I'll have summarized them across different categories. And the category this time around is going to be serve, block ultimate, and also the buff they're able to provide. Because both Hirugami, they are kind of like a semi-supporter as well, okay? So let's start off with the short one, which is basically their surfing skill. Very similar. The UR one basically have this ability so that when it crit, the enemy can't gain any morale and also exit Team Awakening for that rally. Now for the SP one, the enemy only lose 14 morale rather than actually exit Awakening, but they still can't gain any morale difference. Now the only nice thing about this SP one is that you do not have that condition of critting anymore, but obviously you lose on that functionality of actually forcing the enemy out of morale Awakening as well, okay? As a whole, I'll probably say the SP one is slightly better, purely because even when you try to build UR Hirugami with like an awareness build, you probably still only have like a 50 or 60% chance of actually, getting a crit without any help from the teammate, that is. So as a whole, I'll probably say the SP1 is a bit more consistent, okay? Now let's talk about their blocking ultimate. So the UR1 has this ability where he is able to get an extra 40% in terms of the multiplier when the enemy is actually doing power spike. Furthermore, skill resonance 2, when you actually win the point, you're also able to reduce the cooldown by 6, and also you also have a 20% defense tech buff and also reduce cooldown by a whooping 10 as skill resonance 4, but the condition for that is that the enemy actually need to spam their spike. So basically what happens is that when the enemy spike, you're going to apply a debuff onto the enemy, and when the enemy already has a debuff and still spike, what you can do is then reduce your cooldown, which a lot of time basically means the same character need to spam their spike back to back, okay? So even though this sounds very nice on paper, a whole cooldown reduction by 10, but in reality it's actually quite rare unless you face up against Ushijima, like either you are or SP version of Ushijima, etc. Now let's move on to the SP side. SP side, first of all, rather than some kind of like multiplier when it's the enemy's power spike, this time around is when the enemy actually crit, then what's going to happen, you're going to get a 100% increase to reflect. So that basically means you're pretty much guaranteed to do a crit block as well. And if you remember, crit block normally means at least a 50% increase in terms of damage, because the default value for spirit is already 50. Now, rather than a reduction by 6 when you win a point, for the SP version, it's just going to be a permanent 6 cooldown reduction, okay? There will be 4 cooldown reduction coming from skill 1 and then another 2 coming from skill 3. So in total, that's a permanent 6 cooldown reduction. No other condition needed, which is obviously a lot nicer. And you can also apply a 40% spirit buff as well, once again, when the enemy actually do a critical spike. Then lastly, you don't get the whooping 20% defense technique buff because the SP1 only get 10%, but at the same time his skill 1 does actually also offer 36% increase to both his block, both the stat itself and also the multiplier. And by multiplier, what that basically means is, for example, the number you have when you do your ultimate attack. So for example, it says like percentage, 260% of the ult, etc. So basically you are able to add additional 36% onto that as well. So across the two, if you just compare block ult, it's going to be quite obvious to see that the SP1 basically is so much better. The cooldown reduction, first of all, is permanent. There's no other condition involved. And also, frankly speaking, it's just able to provide a lot more other buff as well. For example, there's a 100% reflex. I know there's a condition when the enemy actually needs to spike, but the meta is kind of like vast majority of the future character or the strong meta characters are going to very likely spike. So this is going to trigger vast majority of the time. And then you have 100% reflex, 40% spirit buff, 10% defense tech, another 36% buff to both block stats and also multiply. Across the whole, it's just going to be a very stronger spy, and also with that permanent reduction for cooldown as well. So clear winner if we just compare the two block ultimate here. Okay. Now let's talk about the buff they're able to provide to the whole team. So for the UR1, basically he have this stacks of buff which he can get per net crossing, and each one of them is going to give a 5% attack and also defense technique. The SP1 has something similar, which is that he is also going to get a stack of buff, but this time it's going to be per touch, and each one of them is going to give 4.5% attack and defense technique, 10% reflex, and also 6% spirit. Now let's just compare the first bullet point as a whole, and you can already see the SP1 is a lot better. First of all, normally every 2 net crossing, you should actually have 4 touches from your side in ideal scenario. So that basically means the attack and defense technique buff that you'll be providing here is already going to be larger than what the UR1 is able to provide. And on top of that, you're also able to provide 10% reflex and also 6% spirit. Although this does need skill rating 4, but you are also able to provide that per stack as well. So, the first bullet point, SP Hirugami is going to be the clear winner. Now, the second bullet point, if we compare it, is that depending on how many stacks you have, you are also able to get some additional effect. The first level, I think you need like 2 stack or 3 stack, you use 15% block. The next one's receive, and then the last one's going to be spike buff. Now, for SP Hirugami, it's slightly different because rather than providing something which is for the whole team, this time around it's actually going to have a restriction because it's only going to apply some kind of buff to those with actually a block ultimate. And what you're able to do is that depending on how many cooldown is that block ultimate's cooldown, you are then able to have a different effect. So if that cooldown is already 8 or more, so that's cooldown limit is already 8 or more, then you can actually reduce cooldown by 4. If it's less than 8, then it's going to be a 15% increase to main stat. And if you just look at the number, 15% to main stat, it's obviously going to be slightly better than 15% to only block, receive, and spike. However, this one is restricted to just block ultimate characters, where this one's to everyone. So I feel like the two are somewhat similar here. It's just like which angle and what kind of team you have. And then this one, reducing cooldown, this is actually going to be a massive win, particularly for 2 characters, which is going to be SP Hoshiyumi Korai and also SP Suki. Okay, this is going to be a massive sim for them because they actually have 2 ult and the spiking ult will also be reduced. But once again, how big of impact this is kind of also is somewhat reliant on your team building. Then the other thing the UR version is also able to offer is actually a 40% main stats buff to the whole team and also 90% for himself. Now the SP one doesn't actually have something which is quite similar. I mean, the buff to himself, you can kind of argue the Hirugami is actually able to provide a bit of like 36% buff to both the block stat and also multiplier, which is somewhat similar because to be honest, the only thing you will be using Hirugami for is blocking. Now in terms of the main stat buff to the whole team, the closest thing the SP Hirugami is actually able to offer is that after Hirugami actually blocks, and also I think this is a skill rating 4 only, but after Hirugami, SP Hirugami actually block, you will be applying 20% main stat buff, but only to those with the blocking skill. So not only the number here is going to be lower, but it's also a lot more restricted. And furthermore, you can also apply 2000, so this is just a raw number, no percentage, but you're also able to add 2000 to the block stats and also the quick spike stat, but once again that's only to the front row, so once again a lot more restricted. Now if you just compare the kit for the two themselves, you realize they are, I mean, on a high level, what they're able to provide is somewhat similar. Basically, they have a short-term cooldown block ultimate, which is going to be very strong, and at the same time, they also provide a lot of AoE buff to the whole team. And the main one, which is going to be kind of very nice for Hirugami, is actually the attack and defense technique buff, because not many characters are actually able to provide that, and that's kind of one of the main selling points for both versions of Hirugami. Okay, they're able to provide, they're one of the best provider of the technique buffs. Now there are going to be some slight variation between the two, and I feel the biggest difference between the two, if I have to summarize it, is that the UR version of Hirugami is also able to apply some kind of main stat buff, which the SP1 doesn't really apply too much, whereas the SP1 is actually able to offer a lot more value for those with either blocking skill or more noticeably for those with the blocking ultimate, which makes it a bit more specialized as well. Now if we compare the things that they're both able to already offer, so what I just said is obviously a difference between them, right? So UR is able to offer a main stat buff, which the SP doesn't have, and also SP version is able to offer some more specialized buff to those with blocking ultimate, which is something the UR one which is not able to offer. So that's kind of the main difference that I can think of. However, if we are talking about the ones which are similar and common between the two, it's very clear to see the SP Hirugami kind of outshines the UR1 for the common features they have. So for example, the attack and defense technique buff, etc. SP Hirugami is able to provide a larger value and also quicker and also more consistent than what the UR1 is able to do. The cooldown reduction, the one SP Hirugami have built in for himself, is also a lot better and more permanent than the UR1. Even from surfing perspective, this one is no longer conditional on just crit, etc. So for all of the features that they already have in common, it's quite clear to see the SP Hirugami basically just power creeps the UR1, okay? But the UR1 does offer something additional, which is that main stat buff, which the SP1 doesn't really have. So that's a quick comparison between the UR and the SP version of Hirugami. With all that being said, should you actually summon for it? Now, obviously, the SP version is going to power creep the UR one, but there is going to be a time difference of 7 months, and that was also kind of the rationale behind my opinion regarding summoning for Hoshiyumi Korai. Well, 2 weeks ago when I made that video. However, for Hirugami, it's going to be a slightly different case because I guess the main role that Hirugami, both UR and SP version that they play is the fact they have really strong block, and also at the same time they are a very good supporter in terms of giving that technique buff, which is quite rare out of all of the characters out there. Yes, Hirugami, the UR1 can also provide some main stat buff, but a lot of other people can also do that, so that's not really his selling point. The main selling point for both UR and SP version is actually that attack and defense technique buff. However, those two are not the only characters who are able to provide that. There's actually another mid blocker who can also do that, which is actually going to be SP Crow. And that's kind of why, if we actually consider that into consideration as well, you are Hirugami, if you do actually summon for him, it's not really giving you a 7 months advantage over summoning for SP1, because the SP version of Crow is actually coming out in just about 2 months time. So actually, if you do spend the resources to summon for this UR1 for the time being, it's only just going to be a 2 months lead. Now, whether or not you think that's useful or not, that's up to you to decide whether or not it's good value for money. But just bear in mind that the UR version of Hirugami essentially will be power crept by the SP version of Crow, not in 7 months time, but just in a mere 2 months time, okay? Now, of course, you could also make the argument that why don't you just play both the UR version of Hirugami and also the SP version of Crow together on the same team? And of course you can do that, but the awkward thing with that is that if you actually look at the two banners around SP Crow, the banner immediately before SP Crow is actually SP Suki, who has very good synergy with Crow, so you could argue why don't you just go and summon for Suki instead? And then the banner right after SP Crow is actually SP Kunami, who you could also argue is the most important ace man on this game, because he can actually give effect even from the bench, and that stamina regeneration effect as well, which is very useful, and you actually need skill resonance too for that to work. So it's essentially you not only have SP Crow, who will be power creeping UR version Hirugami, but all of the banners around SP Crow are a lot more valuable in some sense than UR version of Hirugami as well. So unless you have absolutely tons of resources, you can guarantee, for example, Suki and Crow and let's say SR2 version of Konami. Otherwise, it's going to be quite hard for you to justify spending diamonds in order to actually summon for those for UR version of Hirugami rather than those 3 SP characters. Now, if you actually have lots of UR tickets at hand, then that's another question, because then the competition is not actually whether or not you want to summon for SP Crow and the Co, because they use SP tickets, so it's not transferable from UR tickets. However, in those cases, you don't have to make a decision considering the next 2 UR character, which will be coming out after UR Hirugami, and that's actually going to be Komori and also Sakusa, and both of them, despite being UR characters, they actually have SP level stats. So once again, that's another consideration to make, whether or not it's actually worth justifying spending some money or spending some tickets on UR version Hirugami only for that to be power crept in 2 months time, when instead you could have used the same UR ticket for another character of a different role, which wouldn't be power crept anytime soon. Okay, so those are all of the things you have to consider. But yeah, hopefully this video was helpful to you guys. Let me know whether or not you are planning to summon for UR version Hirugami.